Okay, so I'm going to put the outline I'm working off in the chat. So if you want to follow on the outline, you can do that as well, or we can just follow the Makara. Um, okay, but I think we should probably start off by following the outline, and we'll see where we go. Okay, so here is the outline. Okay, so I start by going over the initial Rashis, just so we have clarity on where we're trying to go. So these are the original Rashis on our sugya in Chulin. Right, Kol Mirin, right, Rashi explains Behemoth Chulin Zu Tachos Zu Shel Hekdesh, and our question on that is, okay, we know that in the Gemara there's going to be a Havamina followed by a Hachikatani. So in the Mishnah, as Rashi explained it according to the Havamina or the Maskana, that's really the biggest methodological question. Um, okay, then the ancillary question about that is, when Rashi explains the Mishnah and the Maskana, what is his explanation, and particularly what changes between the Havamina and the Maskana? I have been trying to move all along towards a position that this is related to the two possibilities in the sugya in the later sugya in Chulin, that one of them makes it an object, one of them makes it a subject, but I may abandon that this week. Right, so we'll see. That may have been a half a minute with a half-life that is about to expire. Um, okay. Rashi cites the V'lo Yamir twice, once for the Isser and once for the Malkos. We don't know why he does that. We don't know whether there's a difference between Lo Yamir and Lo Yachlifena. We'll see that comes up this week as well. Right? Is he going out of his way to recite the one to cite Lo Yamir as opposed to the other one? In the Gemara, Rashi has Achi Garcinan, which removes the terrorist being Amar Rav Yehuda. Is there any reason to think that he thinks Rav Yehuda can't be the one who says that, or does he think it's just not Amaraic? That's an interesting question on its own right. And then in Rashi's commentary on the Maskana, right, he seems to bring in, or he even retranslates Bein al Pi Anashim, Bein al Pi Nashim from Echad Anashim ve'Echad Nashim, which seems to suggest that he thinks that this matters in the end. However you construct the text of Rashi, he says can go in the or whatever it is the Imemira Afilu Isha. So Rashi seems to think that there's a key point in the national pinashim. We don't know why he does that as well. Okay, those are our five basic questions in the Rashi on the Mishnah. Right? Does he explain the Mishnah according to Havamina Maskana? How does he explain it in the Maskana? Why does he say V'liyamir twice? Is there a reason he removes Rabbi Yehuda? And why the emphasis on Nashim in his commentary on the Maskana? Okay, then we had two questions that came in from Chulin. Right, one is our Gemara begins with a presumption Akol Memir Lechatchila. Is that really true? But in Chulin we know it seems maybe that's not true, specifically about Temurah, because the Gemara in Chulin uses the Mishnah in Temurah to challenge that position. So the question is, so we know that in Temurah, the Gemara, right, in Chulin, the Gemara says, hang on a sec, isn't a kol shochtin lechatchila? No, a kol shochtin can't be lechatchila because a kol amirin isn't. And then it responds, hasam kidekatani tama. So whatever the answer kidekatani tama is, you have three options. One is that our sugya in Temurah goes on in blissful unawareness of that, and throughout, right, and nothing in our sugya relates to that line hasam kidekatani tama. The second possibility is that our sugya, second possibility is that our sugya's Havamina knows that teretz, but its maskana is something different. And the third is that our teretz is the same as that one, or at least that our maskana goes along with that maskana. Okay, right. So we know that there is a way of reading the Mishnah in Temurah, the Mishnah of Temurah in Chulin that uses it to resolve the question, is every hakol lechatchila? But we don't know whether our Gemara is following that or not. And then we have right, and if we say hakol in Temurah means b'diavad in the end, right? If we think that the maskana in Temurah is that hakol really means b'diavad, does that resolve the Mishnah? Hang on a sec. What about Chulin, where the Gemara when it gives that resolution, the Gemara then says tar to b'diavad lamadli. Okay, so Rashi gets rid of both of these questions in Chulin. Rashi in Chulin says that Hakol means L'chatchila by default, but in Temurah, the next line of the Mishnah undoes it and makes it B'diavad, but the Mishnah still keeps the form of the L'chatchila because it likes standard forms, right? That's Rashi's understanding of what Hasan Ketani Tama means, that the Mishnah in Temurah explains that the first line isn't lechatchila, even though it sounds like it should be, and don't be bothered by that because that's just the language of the Mishnah. Okay, and then Rashi says there's no tarti b'diavad in Temurah, and there he has a two-part answer. All right, this is Rashi in Chulin says this about Temurah. He says there's no tarti b'diavad in Temurah because one, it's not consecutive. It's not like a kol shochadim shchitas l'kshera. And if you're going to tell me, but it is consecutive because it says lo shadam rashai l'hamir, the answer is that is intended to teach malkos, even though it's a lav she'ein bo a maaseh. So the one thing I'm going to add here on this is when Rashi says it comes to teach right, that the second line lo shadam rashai l'hamir is necessary, and it's not tarted yevid lamali, because the second line is the expansive nature of the second line is necessary to teach me that you get malkos for lav she'ein b'maseh. It can't be that that's what the word hakol comes to teach me, because every case l'chora of Temurah is a lav she'ein b'maseh. Hakol has to include a case of Temurah that would otherwise not have been included. So Rashi's answer is not an explanation of the hakol. There is just an explanation of why the whole line is necessary. Right? It's possible that Rashi will still think the word hakol comes to include a specific case, but that can't be. Rashi's not saying that hakol comes to include lav she'ein b'maseh. Okay, so we know how Rashi gets rid of the two kashas from Chulin, which seems to think that Rashi is clear that somehow we have to interpret the maskana of the Gemara in Temurah as well as meaning that it's akar hakol lechatchila. Probably, we don't know exactly how he does that. Okay, so then we have a tangent that, for now, at least a tangent for now, that Rashi says is designed to teach us that Malchus is alav she'ein b'maseh, but above Messiah, it turns out there's a machlokas Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Rish Lakish says the Mishnah follows Rabbi Yehuda, who says it's Malchus and alav she'ein b'maseh. Rabbi Yochanan says that Temurah is alav sheyesh b'maseh. So the question is, why does Rashi read our Mishnah only according to Rish Lakish? And the answer, which is not going to come up with this, is going to come next week, is at the very, very end of our sugya. The answer that the Gemara in Bav Metzia gives for Rish Lakish is given by our Gemara for Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. And so just hold off, right? With is Rashi maybe that could explain why Rashi doesn't think Rav Yehuda belongs in the sugya earlier if he thinks those two positions are inconsistent. We don't know that for sure. Okay. Right, that for this week is a tangent. We should just keep that in mind because it will become important. Well, it'll become important at the end of this week, and then we'll pick it up next week. Okay, then we had a question from Menachos. Right, the question from Menachos we said is the Gemara Menachos says Arbaim bekisve v'kasher. So how can we say that Temurah get right? Is it in principle okay to say that Temurah gets you whipped and creates a kosher korban? So we pointed out that's only according to Rabbeinu Tam. Right, Rashi Menachos, who is followed by the Reed Chulin, doesn't say that that's what it phrases at all. They only think the problem is how can we tell you to do it. So Rabbi Tam creates all sorts of interesting things because he reads that sugya as saying that there's a fundamental problem with saying that you get malchus for something that creates a kosher korban, or the other way around, that you get that you create a korban, you created a kosher korban, and still you get malchus. Which are two separate issues. One is you get malchus that created a kosher korban. What are you getting malchus for? You created a korban. And the other possibility is is that we're making you pay twice for the same iser. Right, so two different ways of framing the same question. But that's only according to Tam. Rashi says in Menachos clearly that's not how he understands it. Because Rashi says, "Hu chayev lulkos arbaim al shehemer kedetnan shem hemer mumar v'sovek arbaim v'atamart yafrish lechatchilo l'shein Temurah." So Rashi thinks the problem there in the case of the Toda is that we're telling you to do it. Not that right. I think Rashi is pretty clear that way. Okay. Rabbeinu Tam, based on his overall reading, which is driven by by his reading of that sugya in Menachos, says that when we say the L'chachila b'di'evid in all our sugya about the Mishnah in Temurah, don't mean you're allowed to do it if you did it. If you did it, this is what happens. What they mean is mezid and shogeg. L'chatchila means mezid, and b'di'evid means shogeg. Okay, and he says that hakol comes to include mezid as well, and there's some controversy. It comes to include mezid for what? for Korban, for Kedusha or Malkos, and that's the whole question that there's a so again Daf Yud Gimel, which seems to think that Shogeg is a Bir Chedesh and Mazid. So as Rabbi Tam here say that a kol comes to include Mazid, you can work that out however you want. The Reed points out that Rabbi Tam's reading doesn't seem to fit our Mishnah's emphasis on Echad Anashim ve'Echad Nashim, and that is certainly true. Right? We don't know what Echad Anashim ve'Echad Nashim is doing here, according to Rabbi Tam, who thinks the only difference is Shogeg versus Mazid. And we pointed out that this actually emphasizes a different issue, which is why does anybody think, right, that you need a kol comes to include anything when it says Echad Anashim ve'Echad Nashim? Obviously, it comes to include women. Right, so that's a right. That's a basic problem that we have with the sugya. If you look at the Makar, right, so Rabbeinu Tam shows up in three different places, but for our purposes, they're all the same. One is Sefer Yasher. Okay, now the Ri in Tmura, because he rejects Rabbeinu Tam, says the following: L'chein perish Ri, Detana behakol memirin lishna alima mishum nashim. Okay, so the Ri says that it says Hakol Memirin Lishna Alima, right? It means it frames it as a lechatchila language. Hakol Memirin. Why? Because of women. Right. So let's be careful what the Ri is saying. He's not saying that Hakol is to include women. He's saying that the reason we frame it as Memirin is because otherwise we would misinterpret the message regarding women. The Amar Lekaman. Because later on the Gemara, that's what we'll do. Actually, I should say now we're 2 weeks because next week is Purim, right? So we'll skip next week, both Tuesday and Wednesday, and we'll resume in 2 weeks. Okay. So we have later on in our sugya, it will tell us that we need that there's an extra pasuk intended to include women for something. The Sagadata Chamina. Because I would have thought, Ahani miyute v'ahani ribuya, Ahani ribuya lashmina d'tmuras nashim kadshi. So I would think that since we have the miyut, which is the claim kol inyan medaber b'lashon zachar, whatever that means, and we have the ribuy, which is hamer yamir, both the whatever the something infinitive, whatever it's called. Right, that is the form, right? That's the form, the name for the form, I think, right? If you remember, Will, you can tell me what the correct. It's nice.
Infinitive absolute. Infinitive
Did anyone
absolute,
else
I
somehow?
think.
No. There we go. Okay, sorry. Um, something infinitive. I forget what it is. Um, okay, so the Reese says I would have thought that even if I had this drasha to include women, it doesn't include women the whole way. And his way of including women not the whole way is that they get that Hamir Yamir means that their tumor is kadosh, but it doesn't get brought as a korban. So Hakol Mirin tells you that it even makes it into a korban. Okay, right, but I think that once you have the restructure, you can figure out for yourself, uh, what the really tells you, right? Beyond this is look, somehow, right, there is a basis for thinking that women are excluded in some way from some part of Tomorrow. Okay, all right, and Rashi, and I want to put, the reason overall explanation, right, we get from the reader that's true, and that he'll see he gets from the sugya, it's undeniable. But Rashi's whole point is that it's not Lishna Lima. Rashi's whole point is that if we take Rashi and Chulin as dispositive, Rashi's whole point is that it's just Derech Tanaim. So Rashi can't give the Reis explanation as to what Hakol Mirin is for, but Rashi doesn't need an explanation of what Hakol Mirin is for. We just need to know what, according to Rashi, how we read it. Okay, then the last thing we had lining up our issues was we did this Gilya Atosar Ben Eliezer B'Tuch, which was really quite odd, and we'll point out the oddities again. So he quotes, right, so on the line of Ben Tam, the Shinui Dehacha Havi Kahidi Tmura, he says, okay, the Hasa, meaning Tmura, Ka'amar She'en Lasas Takanot Chatchil in Zeshi Akor Halav. So, right, what does that mean? It sounds like he's introducing the wild case of Tmura's Toda, where at least we have a Havamina that we should tell people to make a Tmura in, but it's very, very hard to figure out how he gets that into the language of the Teretz in Tmura. Um, Okay, and then we have in right. Then he says, "Ulfia maskana the isarich hakol diavad." So according to maskana, the hakol is there for a b'diavad, not lechatchila. Right. So now we're not reading it. We're not reading it like Rabbeinu Tam at all. Istrich le'asuye de asr lehamir compared to Rabbeinu Tam. So I don't know what he's doing. Uh, right, I don't know what he's doing when he says it's like Rabbeinu Tam. According to the maskana, that hakol is diavad, which is so that has to be according to maskana in chulin. Right? Where Ashi says that all hakols are b'diavad, so it has to come to tell you that it's asur lahamir. What? The pasuk comes to tell you it's asur lahamir. So, though, right, if you take it really literally, he's saying that maybe Rabbi Tam thinks it's only asur if you do it accidentally, which is just totally weird. Right? So I don't think we understand that line at all. Omishum Sovek Darbayim, that makes Kuntras, that makes sense, but I don't understand what he's saying. And finally, we had the wild position of Rashmul Veradun, who says Alav lo yamir ein loke, but the Mishnah says Sofek Darbayim. So what are we talking about? Right? We could try and put this into separating lo yamir and lo yachlifenu and claiming that lo yamir is alav titach laseh and lo yachlifenu is not, but I just put out all those Rishonim, all the Rishonim cited this Gilion are saying totally weird things as far as we can tell, which means either that they're all corrupt in some way, that we're totally missing the context, or that there's something we're completely missing. Okay, fine. So with that, let's go on to the Beit Medrash of the Ramban. Okay, so Ramban. So the question I want to ask in Ramban is right. So before we read it, right, is how does he understand the shift of the Hachikatani, right? Because the core issue for everybody is right to understand is that something changes in Tmura between the Havamina and the Maskana, but before the Hachikatani and afterwards, and how do they understand that? So we had a position of Rashi that what changes is we thought it was lichatchila, but really it's b'di'evah, but we don't know what that means. We have the two options of the sugi and chulin, but that maybe the havamina is that it means everybody does it, and the maskana is everything can be made tmura. Right, and we have Rabbeinu Tam who thinks that it's all right that it's always lechatchila intended to include to include mezid. Okay, right. So now let's take a look at the Ramban. So I'm gonna shift the share to the other right this to the Makara. There we go. Okay, and so now here we are in the Ramban. Um, yeah, I'm one two. Okay, here on the no, I was right there. Yeah, okay. Here's Ramban. Okay, so Ramban starts off by quoting Rashi, and he goes to Rabbeinu Tam, and then he says the following. The Yesh, right. So now he's following Rabbeinu Tam's position that lechatchila and b'diavad are reinterpreted, and what Hasab Katani Tama meant in Tmura was that really the Mishnah in Tmura is lechatchila, but it's lechatchila using the meaning of mezid as opposed to lechatchila using the meaning of of you're allowed to do it. The Yesha Shalom. Kevan de Maskinan de Hakol Ika Lechatchila v'Ika Diavad. Okay, the Ramban says, hang on a sec. So now I have said, according to Rabbeinu Tam, that I know that actually in the end, the teretz, the Hasik Katani Tama, really Tmura means the Lechatchila. But in the end, Rav Ashi says that actually they're both B'diavad. Because Rav Ashi says in the end, Tarti B'diavad Lamali. So there's some people who ask, since in the end in Chulin, Rav Ashi reaches the conclusion that there are some hakols that are l'chatchila and some hakols that are b'diavad. My hayde makshina b'tmura hagufa kasha amarta hakol memir l'chatchila v'hadar amarta losha dam rashai l'hamir. So why does the Gemara in Tmura ask the question? Hang on a sec. One of them is l'chatchila, one of them is b'diavad. According to the Maskana in Chulin, the first one is b'diavad also. And so the Gemara gives an answer to that question. Right? How the Gemara's answer to the question is, "Oh, don't worry about it. All right, we're going to reinterpret the Resha, but why do we have to reinterpret the Resha? It wasn't the Chatchil in the first place, right? The Halamaskana lahacha, because according to Maskana here in Chulin, leka kushya, dakol David namihu." Okay, so the Ramban's question is, I don't understand. Shouldn't the sugya in Tmura start from the proposition that ends the sugya in Chulin? All right, that's right. That's his right. That's his problem. Right? How can the sugya in Tmura end up thinking that Hakol means lechatchila when the sugya in Chulin ends up saying that this right, saying that even this Hakol, saying that Hakol means b'diavad, right? What's the problem in the first place? So now Ramban says, "L'didi lo kasha," but according to me, I have no problems. The chol Hakol lo lechatchila. Because what do I mean, says Rambam, when I say that not every hakol is a chatchila? Meaning, what does the sugya in Chulin mean? What does Rav Ashi mean at the end of the sugya in Chulin when he says that not every hakol is lechatchila? Al korchin hachim mitparish. Hakol matfisin b'tmura. Hakol ma'arichun matfisin be'erech. Okay, so Ramban says that to say that hakol is b'diavad follows a standard form. Okay, we know, right? We know what it means to translate the language of Hakol, this right Hakol Memira and Hakol present tense, right? We know it, right? We know what to do with that. When we make that b'di'evid, it always means we translate it a particular way. V'hasem mafarish of Gemara mishum de mevarshishim b'masnisim b'di'evid. Okay, right? And so therefore, when the Gemara in Tmura, when it says Hachi Katani, it's actually saying the same thing as the Gemara in Chulin. Okay, umiu kol heichad have b'diavad al korchan ki agav misparish. It's not so really. It's not an ad hoc teretz in Tmura. It's just telling you, no, actually, the hakol in Tmura is b'diavad like every other b'diavad. V'hakol shochatin hacha idiavedhu v'chi agavnim mitukam. Meaning, it means hakol machshirin b'shchita. Okay, so in the end, right, the Ramban says that thank you, Nadav, infinitive absolute, good. So the end, the Ramban says you have to read the sugya in Chulin in right together with the sugya in Tzmura, but not the way that Rabbi Tam said. Right, so I'm just going to put that to show that really clearly what's the differences between Ramban and and um, and the Rabbeinu Tam. So we go back to the outline. So here we go, right? So Rabbeinu Tam says, "V'nir Rabbeinu Tam the Shnei Hachi Havikai T'Mura V'Hachi Kamar Hasid Ketani Tama." Right? We'll got this the first time, right? When I didn't get it right. V'Hachi Ketani Kol Amir Demashma Lechatchila. So Rabbeinu Tam says that we should read the maskana in T'Mura according to the intermediate maskana in Chulin. Whereas the Ramban says, he's talking about the final teretz. Right? That akol shochin d'hacha idiyeveti, right? That where we're talking in Rav Ashi. Okay, so in the end, both Rabbeinu Tam and the Ramban read the sugyas in Chulin and T'mura together, but they line them up differently. Okay, now the question is though, what does Ramban mean when he says that there's a standard way of converting the lechatchila language of Hakol X into b'diavad? So his language is right. We'll go back to his language. His language is um, right. Hakol matfisin b'tmura. Okay, Hakol matfisin b'tmura. That's the ambiguity we've had all along. Whether it means everybody can be matfis something in tmura, or it means everything can be nitpas in tmura. But Hakol marichin matfisin be'erech is harder. And later he says Hakol machshirin b'shchita. So okay, before I say it, tell me what you think. Right? What does Ramban think changes between the Hava Amina and the Maskana in Temurah? What's the difference between Hakol Memirin and Hakol Matfisin B'Temurah?
I mean, doesn't it sound like he's saying something about it being my piece in between is unambiguously b'diavad? I don't see why he says that, but that's the thing.
Yeah, so that's right. So that's right. How does well? So let's start two questions. Does it sound like he's changing the hakol from the subject to the object, or is he keeping it the same subject and just changing the lechatchila to the b'diavad?
I have a feeling I know where you want to go with it, but it
Yeah,
still sounds like he's saying Hakol is the doer, not the done to.
I agree. No, I don't want to. That's why I said I might abandon it this week. I would like it if he said it the other way, but I don't think he does. I think you're right. I think he seems. I think what he's saying is you just reinterpret the words from lechatchila to saying that it has the effect of. So that's a right. That's a difficult thing to read into Achiketani, particularly because it fails to disambiguate for us, right? Because we can still read it the other way. But I think that's Akol Machshirin B'Shchita. That's it's hard to read that, as everything. And you could read it as everything we make right? Hard, hard. So I want to at least, right? I think at least the strong possibility has to be put out. The Ramban thinks that all that happens between the Halavim and the Maskana, when we change the L'Chadchila to B'diavad, is we just change our understanding of it from, oh, that's obviously L'Chadchila, to no, you can make it B'diavad by saying that it has the consequence. Um, so I think that's it's a very unsatisfying. It's a very unsatisfying explanation. But the question is, maybe it's what Rashi meant also. I think that anytime one Rishon says something, then at least then it's a possibility somebody else could have said the same thing. Um, so we'll have to go back through the Rashi's right where Rashi explains what he means by kol, and we'll see that they're all ambiguous. Right, this is mostly a quote. So maybe that's what Rashi means. And if we went back to Rashi in Chulin, right, let's go back and take a look at Rashi in Chulin. Let's see if we can do that quickly and see what we think that what Rashi's language is. But we'll have to check also Rashi in Rashi in so we're checking Rashi in Shmur. We also check Rashi in Chulin, Rashi in Nachos. All right, so Rashi says, what does it mean? Hakol matfisin kolomar shetufeses kedushas tmura b'vehema bein al pi anashim bein al pi anashim. I don't know. I don't know. It sounds to me more like Rashi there is trying to focus on the done to, but
But that could just be read as it's effective, not as right. It's not changing the referent of Hakol, but rather just saying,
yeah, you could
what
read
does
it
it
that
mean?
way.
It means it works, right?
Yeah, you could read it that way. It's a wild language, right? Shetufesek tmura, right? He could just say she shegam anashim gam nashim yecholim lahatfis tmura bevehema, but that doesn't follow the language or the order of the Mishnah, so maybe. Right? It's the same kind of awkward thing here. Dinamira afilu isha tofeses al piha kedushas tmura. Right? The language is constantly circuitous. Um, okay, so right, we can go back quickly and we can take a look at the Rashis in the other sugyot and see what we think. Um, right, so here's Rashi and Bava Metzia says following. Right, right. Rashi and Bava Metzia says, "Umefarish v'azil v'dahay v'akol memirin lo shadam rashai lamir elo yesh ben koach litfos b'tzmur b'diavad." So that's pretty. That sounds very much like Ramban. That right. That it's right. That it's still the doer. So Rashi B'Metzia, right? That's pretty right. That's a pretty good evidence for him. And Rashi in Chulin says, um, right, uh, um, V'reisha hachi kamar hakol din tmura noheget bahem.
I want to point out, by the way, I checked the manuscripts of Rashi. We have four manuscripts of Rashi and Hulen. They
Yeah,
all say Torat Temurah as opposed to Din
din
Temurah.
tmura.
I don't think it
Okay,
changes the meaning, but it says, but that
thank
seems to
you.
be the original reading in Rashi.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's I agree with you both ways. Good to know, and I don't see how it changes it in this case. Okay, you can say hakol din tmura noheget bahem means all people. The din tmura applies to them. Um, but eh, eh,
No, actually, I like it better. I
you
think
do.
that's good, actually. Yeah, because that helps with the Echad Nashim, right? The idea being that what that clause comes to include is specifically everybody is kind of within the Torah of Tamura, right? Meaning women also. Like that's the
I
I
see
don't
the
know, that
temptation. I'm not convinced. I see the temptation. Okay, so but it's not. I'm not going to be satisfied because the problem is, that Rashi doesn't disambiguate well enough. Right? That's his job. Right? That's really the underlying problem for me all the way through is that what's the point of Rashi if you have to be Mefarish Rashi afterwards on the axis when everyone else is trying to explain. Okay, let's okay, we'll just finish through the end of these Makuras. We'll see if some of this gets we can clarify next week to make sure we understand the Beis Medrash Shel Ramban. So just to the Rashba here is kind of wild, right? It's just sort of fun to go through where the Rashba, like sort of approached academic Talmud and then sort of said, "Nah, can't do that." The Rashba says, "Hang on a second, I don't understand what's going on with Yahweh Maskana," and he ends up with right. So you follow. He says, "Mitoch karach nirali." The Ravashi vade me kara nami ikar kushya tarti lamali kashuli. So his problem is, how can Ravashi change his mind? Because he assumes that the dialogue all the way through is every teretz is given by Ravashi, and therefore Ravashi says both Hasim Katani Tama and Ravashi says Tarti David Lamali, but according to Rabbeinu Tam, that generates a contradiction. So he can't right. So he can't deal with Rabbeinu Tam, right? So he quotes Rabbeinu Tam, then he says, "I don't understand Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam makes no sense because he makes Ravashi inconsistent. So his solution is Mitel Kafnirli. The Ravashi Vademe Karanami Iker Kushya Tarti Lamle Kashali. Ravashi from the very beginning knew that he thought it was Bidyevet. Ela Katzar Lashono Kedarkel Shudivre Chachamim. The Savar Shehevin Ravacha Kushyasu. Ravacha lo Hevin. Okay, so the first question is based on Rav Acha's misunderstanding of Ravashi. Uh, okay, and then the end is right, but then he says, "Allah bedad Ravashi shikshale," but Ravashi misunderstands what the question is, and so the whole sugya turns into this right sort of comic misunderstanding where no one understands anyone else all the way through. Right, it says, "B'dir Ravachi," at the end, "B'dir Ravachi lekaman u'masha tashi Ravashi mochi should be masha heshiv Ravashi mochichin kain." Sh'ad hasof lo hevina achad et dad chaviro lo zeh kushiyato shel zeh v'lo zeh tshuva Shavatel Shalzeh. All right, that's an amazing thing, right? So, I think like it sounds much firmer to say, "Oh, you know what? That's the stuff with the Gemara explaining a line in the middle," as opposed to saying that the entire conversation between Ravashi and Ravashi is a dialogue of the deaf. Right? Not one of them ever understood a word the other one said. Um, okay, right? Please just be aware. Yeah, and they're all and what the Rosh was pointing out is that as we point out that fundamentally the difference between Rabbeinu Tam and the Ramban is how to do the cheshbon. Do you want Tamura to line up with the intermediate position in Chulin, or do you want Tamura to line up with the bottom of the page in Chulin? And the possibility I keep raising is maybe we want Tamura to line up with the very end of the sugya in Chulin. That's on Daf Tezayin. Right? We're all doing the same thing. Right? We're all trying to make the right. We're all trying to make the positions right. The lines in the sugya line up because it's really awkward to have Tamura be totally different Right, you have three different terutzim for this problem in right in Chulin, and Temurah is a fourth one. That seems a little bit odd, and we particularly odd in Rashi because Rashi keeps on right cross-referencing them in Chulin. Okay, other positions in the base Medrash Shel Ramban. Um, okay, right. So now the Ritva says that Rabbeinu has to explain this according to his explanation, but according to Rabbeinu Tam, there's no problem because Hasam Akol Matfisim B'Tzmura Katanei. So that helps me not at all, and it seems to be utterly backwards from the way the Chiddush Ramban has it himself. So I'll just point out, it seems to me that happens a lot. That Rabbeinu Tam's position everyone's position gets reversed. I don't know how to read the Ritva to be consistent with this. I don't think, unless I'm blowing it. The Iran says the following. Rashi explains the Akar Leila Kol Dereisha L'Tem L'Chadchilu K'Moshe Kasa B'Firusho. That's Rashi and Chulin. V'lona here. The Lashon Hasan Ketani Tama Mashma De'asi Lo Kume Li'olum L'Chadchilu U'Ketani Tama the Akar Leila Kol Dereisha L'Kedivrei Rashi Zal. So this obviously doesn't follow because he starts off by saying Perish Rashi and then he says V'lona here and says this Kedivrei Rashi. So okay, a lot of stuff went wrong. A lot of stuff went wrong in the Beis Medrash Ramban. I think the Ramban itself is the best witness we have. Okay. Right. He just tells you explicitly the Tame the Miskav in Lav or Lo Yitpos. Can I read him in Parakatoda? Because right. He's just going all along. He's going with Rabbeinu Tam's shot all along. And okay, right, that Ramban plainly rejects that position of Rabbeinu Tam. So there's an interesting intellectual history question as to what really happened with Beit Midrash Shel Ramban on this question. Okay, let's now go to Achronim. So here, these don't matter to us very much. Just tell you that the Yad David suggests right. It sounds like Rabbi Tam actually has the girsa echad shogev echad mezid, but his maskana, which I think is correct, is l'cheinira da'af Rabbi Tam lo garis hacha behedi begemara elash mefarish kem gemara dakol memirin. Right, I think that's right. And he says if that's so, the Ri has a really good question that the Gemara brings echad nashim v'echad nashim. So how can you tell me that the whole point is mezid and shogeg? Really good question. Okay, the Mishmaras Kahuna, on the other hand, says that is the girsa. Okay. Nah, I don't think so. Fine. Okay, so now let's get to the Cheshek Shlomo, which I think is right that and the Rav. Those are our last two. Those are our last two things in this unit, and yeah, then maybe we'll finish early. Okay. The Mishnah Losha Dam Rashai L'Hamir. So Nichtab B'Tzideo Lichora Tema. Dehech Yaleh Ladat Rashai L'Hamir Haksiv Behedya Lo Yachlifenev Lo Yamiroto. Okay, so he asked the question boldly. There shouldn't even be the Havamina shouldn't even be a Havamina. Right? There's a pasuk. So you can right, and so Rashi even quotes the pasuk in order to explain this line of the Mishnah. But what right that it's just absurd to say the Mishnah has to come and tell me right that's Lo Shadam Rashal. I mean we knew that doesn't right that's a waste of space. Okay, you can decide it, we can have a whole discussion about whether the Mishnah assumes that you know Tanakh by heart and what it means and all that kind of stuff. But he, asks the question that, which I think is the right question. Maybe there are some Havaminas that are too ridiculous, and it doesn't even seem like the Gemara really takes it seriously. Right? So we keep right. So there are technical ways out, but the question itself is blunt, and he's going to take the question on its own terms. He says, "V'nira mishum diyesh makom litot." The eno aver belav rak im mitkavein lamir behemat chulam b'shel kodesh sheteitzezu v'tikanezu. Aval b'mitkavein shu shnehem kodesh hu t'murato eno over. Okay, so he says the thing that somebody had to suggest, and I have to decide whether now that somebody said it, now I have to figure out does it make sense or not. He says that maybe the havamina is that Tmura only is behema zu tachatzu. Right? Maybe right. The havamina is only if you want to replace it, and the punishment is they both become kodesh. But if you want them both to become kodesh, why would you make that usher? That's the havamina. So so we have to say lo shadam rashai lamir because I might have thought that doing tmura was mutter. What was aser was being machalif. Okay, now to back that up, he has one of the wildest Tosfos anywhere anywhere in Shas. You can if you know this right, this Tosfos who says that it's not aser if you're not over by your matzah if you keep chametz with the intent of burning it. Okay, that's a wild, wild Tosfot, but take that Tosfos as a
What?
given.
Sorry, can I ask a question? Why is that so wild? There's a Tannaitic position that says explicitly that if you don't have access to, I think it's Rabbi Yehuda, if you don't have
Yeah.
access to fire before Pesach, you should hold on to it until Pesach and then burn it because it's more important to burn it and fulfill that mitzvah than to get rid of it some other way. So it's not like out of bounds in terms of like there's a view,
Ravina says that you can't fulfill the essay otherwise.
right? And therefore you should prioritize the essay over the Lotza essay.
No, you can't avoid violating the Lota essay.
Right.
But he doesn't say that you can't avoid violating the Lota essay. You are violating the Lota essay, but you intend to fulfill the essay, right? So it's a much wilder position, right? Here
All
this
right.
is you can get rid
It's
of it.
taking the logic to a greater extreme,
Yeah,
but it's the same logic.
okay. If you want to say, I don't think it's the same logic, like because what else should you do according to the other Talmudic position? Getting rid of it doesn't help you any. It prevents you from being from fixing the law of the essay. I think. Okay, you don't want to think it's that wild? Go ahead. Um, so his claim, right? So his claim, this is the same kind of thing. That even though I do the Isser of Tmura, since my purpose in doing the mitzvah of Tmura is to make everything holy, that's great. Right? And if we're going to frame it as a lav anitak l'aseh, right? What's a lav anitak l'aseh? The lav is doing Tmura, and the aseh is bringing the korbanos. Okay, so right, so maybe the halacha is I should be allowed to do this lav for the purpose of doing the assay, analogous to Tosfos. Now Tosfos does not say that you're allowed to buy chametz before Pesach, so that you can have it on Pesach, so that you can right, so that you can right. So even in Tosfos, right, this is this is this is this is pushing it. He says, "Vim kain." Halamina de gabe tmura nami kenhu, dim bedato l'kayim ha'aseh, rashai bemet lamir. So that's my havamina. Um, okay. V'atam de gabe tmura lo mikri lav anitak laseh, mishum de alav hu kol yoter mehaseh. But we don't call tmura alav anitak laseh generally because tmura includes things that can't be fixed by the assay. Tmura includes trying to replace them. Okay, this is a totally wild idea, and I would probably dismiss it out of hand, except that we will all remember that there is the position of Rosh Shmuel of Radun that we didn't understand at all, right? Rosh Shmuel of Radun said, Rosh Shmuel of Radun, Tiretz alad lo yamir ein loka davi lavanitik lasei. And we didn't understand what he was talking about because you do get malchus. So maybe he meant what the Chiyad David is suggesting, right? You don't get Malkos so long as you can fulfill the assay, like any other, right? Like, right? It's only a theoretical Malkos, and that gets into the question, right? Whether let's say you get Malkos once you're Mevatel the assay, and does it matter whether you do it whether you're Mevatel B'Shogeg or Beis, all those sorts of questions. So I thought I had to put it in here because it's the closest I can get to explaining Shmuel B'Rudin. But I haven't yet seen any hint that this is a factor in Rashi, except that's not true. So that's not true. Because, well, no, Rashi doesn't have love against it. Rashi mentions Lav Shem B'Masa, right? So we'll get there. Yeah. Okay. So, right. So according to Cheshik Shlomo, I don't know what does the word Hakol come to include? Hakol comes to include, L'chora, even people who intend both to become Kodesh. Kind of ironically, right, that Hakol Memirin comes to include in the Isser the people who are doing it lechatchila. Right, really a very very strange position. Okay, so last thing to do before we go on to the next sugya, let us do the Rav. Um, okay, and one of the things we'll get to see here is that which I think all of you probably understand, right, is that In the Rav's generation, they were right, you still couldn't do brisk without cheshbon. You had to do all the mechanics, and then at the end, right, the mechanic, and then you could do the lumdus. You couldn't, right, you couldn't just do lumdus and not figure out how it worked out in the mechanics. But part of I don't know what the Rav Shir was like really that way, but part of the the thing where Reichman does is he puts right is he gives you the whole cheshbon, and not just the chakira. Okay, so he's in Bava Metzia. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's take a look back at the Gemara of Bava Metzia so we know what his context is. So the Gemara of Bava Metzia, that would be how far back do we go? Too far? Chulin, Sanhedrin, Menachos, Bava Metzia. Here we are. So right, so there's a machlokas about chasima, about chasima and kilayim. Right, if you, oops, sorry, keep doing that. I keep forgetting this computer does not doesn't stop unless you stop it. I go too far. I went too far back. Sorry. Um,
It's page 12, if that's
Page
helpful.
12. Thank you. There we are. Okay, good. Yes, thank you. Okay, so chasma bekol and higa bekol. Right. So you do these two. Right. Either losachsam for bedisho or kilayim. Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayev, even though you only did it vocally. Rish Lakish says you're putter. The Gemara says, I hate this. Okay, the Gemara is page 12. Thank you. Let me see if I get it back to page 12. Um, 13, 12. Okay, stay. The Gemara says Machlokas Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish is about whether the moving your mouth is considered a masa. Then Rabbi Yochanan challenges Rish Lakish. Hang on a sec. How can you claim that kol is not a masa? After all, you get malchus for Tmura. And the assumption is, how did that happen? Okay, and the assumption is that was okay. The assumption is that we all know that you can't get malchus on a lav shein b'masa. Therefore, if you get malchus on Tmura, Tmura must also be a masa, and the reason for that must be that speech is a masa. To which Reish Lakish responds to Rav Yochanan, Hamani Rabbi Yehudahi Damar Lav Shein B'Masa Lokin Olav. Okay, so Reish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, no, that right, the Mishnah in Tmura follows the position that you get Malchus for Lav Shein B'Masa. Okay, now the position of Rabbi Yehuda that Lav Shein B'Masa Lokin Olav is quoted elsewhere in Shas, but not in Bava Metzia. But it's kind of an odd thing that it gets quoted in other places, but doesn't get quoted in this sugya. This sugya just makes reference to it. Okay, then the Gemara challenges and says, "Hang on a sec. How can you make the Mishnah and Temurah follow Rabbi Yehuda right? Because the Mishnah and Temurah is against Rabbi Yehuda for a different reason." And the answer is that the author of the Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda, but the author of the Mishnah is a Tana who holds like Rabbi Yehuda about one position and not the other position. Fine. Okay, but right. So that's our background. Our background thing. There's a machlokas, Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan. The Gemara says that the machlok is about whether kol is a masa or not, and Reish Lakish's solution for the Mishnah in Temurah, which seems to say that kol is a masa, is that no, that is the position which he doesn't have to hold, but that Mishnah takes the position you don't need a masa, whereas we all take the position that you do need a masa. Reish Lakish himself says you do need a masa. That's why he thinks that you're a pater right for chasima and nehiga. Right? He just tells you there is such a position, and we don't paskin like the Mishnah in Temurah. Okay. Interesting thing in the end, right? That we don't paskin like that Mishnah. Okay. So now we get to what the Rav actually does. Okay, so let's follow. Lefiza yesh lomar dezui kavanas kushas Rabbi Yochanan. This is what Rabbi Yochanan means when he challenges Reish Lakish. The Mishnah Isa hakol memirin lo shadam rashai lehemir ela shememir mumar v'sofek d'arbaim umistimas lashon haMishnah mashma delokin af keshemir bekorban sibur. Okay, so the Rav comes up with this amazing chiddush. Hakol comes to include korban sibur. Now, what's a korban sibur? So a korban sibur is excluded because I mean this is the introductory sugya that I didn't get to last semester that says that the reason we have two parshios of Tamura is to teach you. Right, to teach you that it has to be like a Masa Bechor, and one of the things we learn from that, which is in a Mishnah later in Masechet, is it's only a Korban Yachid and not a Korban Sibur. So, right, so we're going to work on the assumption that you can't do Tamura on a Korban Sibur. But the Rav says Hakol means that even though you can't do Tamura in the sense that it's not Tofes, right, nonetheless, you do get Malkos for trying. Okay, so this is the exact reverse of the Yad. Right? The Yad David says maybe there's a time when you create Tamura but you don't get Malkos. The Rav says no. Maybe there's a time you get Malkos even though you don't create Tamura. Okay, right? The Afal Pi Deleka Chalos Tamura. Okay, now we go off into the Brisker universe. So if it's true, says the Rav, which now it is obviously, that it turns out that Rav Yochanan's question assumes that you can get Malkos for Tmura even if there is no Chalos of the Tmura. I mean, you don't get Malkos for what happens. You get Malkos for what you tried to do, which makes perfect sense because what happened is a fine thing. Why would you get Malkos for making a korban? Right? So okay, you get Malkos for trying to make something else not a korban. Okay, whether you have a chalos with the second animal, it never right. What always doesn't happen is your failure to be uncut as the first animal. So v'inkein muchach diyesh beis lefanim lavor al isur tmura dahainu. One way of being over it is heichash asa maset tmura b'diburo v'chal nami chalos kedusha tmura. So one way of violating tmura is when you have both a masa and a chalos. And the other one is heichash rak maset tmura v'lek chalos tmura. But you can also violate the isur of tmura if there is a ma'isa without a chalos. Right? Mikol makom chal chi of malkos gam kishalunesta avera bishle musa. Okay, now we have another big move, which is to claim that the failure, it's really just one avera. The avera is a process. It includes a masa and a chalos. And so what we're saying now is you get malkos for tmura for the masa without the chalos. Okay, so now Rosh Yochanan's kasha is v'chanami name v'chasima. The afal pi sheyachol lachsom b'yadayim b'masa rabba right, ichasum b'kol that b'masa zuta tzarech lilkos afal pi shlo avar l'isur lo sachsom b'shleima. So this is a pretty wild sishtel to say that, well, just like you can get malkos, so Rav Yochanan's question is, just like you can get malkos for tmura with no chalos, so too you should be able to get malkos for chasima with a lesser masa. For Rish Lakish mitaris, the Mishnah tmura asa leave Rabbi Yehuda shesover logan allow shein b'masa. And Rish Lakish's answer is no, that proves nothing because Rabbi Yehuda holds you don't need a masa at all. So so the reason that you're chayav malkos by tmura is not because you have a masa without a chalos, is because you don't even have a masa. You don't need anything. Ulam Rish Lakish atzma sover de'ein lokin. Elam can never allow bishlei muso. Ushum hachi sover dechasim v'kol patrei malkos. Rish Lakish himself holds you don't get malkos unless you violate the law completely, and therefore Rish Lakish doesn't hold like Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yochanan does hold like the Mishnah, but Rish Lakish doesn't hold like the Mishnah. Our sugya explains the Mishnah according to Rish Lakish, who doesn't hold like it. But that's true without the Rav. Right? It's true without the Rav that the assumption of the sugya of Metzia is that lav she'ein b'maisa lokin alav. Sorry, lav she'ein b'maisa ein lokin alav. And Rish Lakish's solution to that is, yeah, because we don't hold like that Mishnah. Okay, so now what does it mean that we don't hold like that Mishnah? Does it mean that we don't? Does that mean that we think that Tmura is always a lav she'ein b'maisa, and therefore you never get malkos for Tmura? Okay, that's a really interesting claim. So then, when Rashi says in Bav Metzia that the whole purpose of the second line in the Mishnah is to right Rashi said the second line in the Mishnah is there to teach us about Malkos, right, which is sort of endorsed by Ramban. That the right, so then The whole Mishnah is right. All these explanations of the Mishnah are set up according to a position that we don't hold like, to make the Mishnah a position we don't hold like. Okay, does every sugya have to hold that way? I don't know. Like, does the sugya in Chulin have to hold like the position of the sugya in Temurah? Rashi L'chora says it does, but why? Um, okay, so we have another axis according to which, right, which we can explain all the right. I think everything which everybody suggests as a havamina can end up being for the next person being everything which somebody else suggests as was really pshat. Can be the next person can say no, that's what the Mishnah comes to exclude. Okay, so we have a right. So now we have a possibility that we can divide between the chalos and the malkos. Right, that's really what just wanted somebody was saying that what, maybe you get the malkos without the chalos, or the right, or maybe you get the chalos without the malkos. All those are options in all those are options in Rashi. The big question that we're going to get to um, 2 weeks from now is to think about this. That the underlying question we haven't addressed is the Gemara is about to say Hakola Suyemai and includes something which we haven't discussed at all. So, do any explanation that we have offered, which says that the Hakol is intended to include something, seems to be against that Gemara. That's a weakness, any such explanation. Maybe Rashi doesn't read it that way at all. Maybe the whole point of Rashi is to get out of the problem and say that Hakol comes to include the thing in the Sugya and not to right, and not to include any other cases, and maybe that will be the key to unraveling what Rashi is saying all the way through. Okay, so we're gonna do it in 2 weeks. Is we're going all the way to Gimel and Aleph. Right, we're gonna get to the last words we are going to do are turn. Last words we're gonna do are yeah, right. We're gonna finish at V'tana Didan Sover Yoresh Samech Yoresh Memir. That's on Gimel and Aleph. And my goal is to understand the sugya structurally. Right, first I just want to understand the structure of the whole sugya, and then I want to see if it clarifies anything about what Echad Anashim Ve'echad Nashim might mean. And in Rashi, you'll see, of course, that that the sugya is put together from pieces of other sugyas we've seen. So that's up to you in terms of prep, whether you need to see the other sugya, whether you need to see the other Rashis and such forth. Okay, wishing everyone a happy Adar and Freilich Purim, um, and I guess a white Purim. All right, see you.